elections draw near. Remember, evil prospers when good men and women only wish for peace, but never take a step to make peaceful elections happen. Are you a father? Are you a mother? What are you saying to your children as elections approach? Have you warned them not to let themselves be used to cause violence? Have you explained to them what the consequences of electoral violence might be? Do your part to make peaceful elections happen. Talk to your children. Protect them from unscrupulous politicians who want to put them in harm's way, while their own children are comfortable at home, within, and outside the country. Let's join hands to make 2023 elections peaceful. This message is from the National Orientation Agency, NOAA.
Well, all right, we have as next guest this morning, Dr. Michael Ojo. Dr. Michael Ojo is the Country Director, Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition Gain. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
All right, Dr. Ojo, once again, a pleasure to have you with us. Of course, today is International Women's Day, and it's perhaps advisable to kick off with a linkage with the theme for this year's celebration, Gender Equality Today for Sustainable Tomorrow. Well, what does that tell us about gender equality and nutrition gain? Is there any nexus?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here to have an opportunity to celebrate our women on International Women's Day today. The theme, like you rightly said, is Gender Equality Today for Sustainable Tomorrow. And the campaign hashtag, if you like, is Break the Bias. And what does that mean? I think it's important to be sure that people understand what bias means. So that is when you have a predilection or a preference for something or someone, or you have or you discriminate against something or someone. Sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's unconscious. We've all been listening to and seeing the controversy around the gender bills that didn't pass through the National Assembly. And one of the most, if you like, regressive arguments I heard about this was that our people are not ready, and so we cannot, pass this bill. As men, we need to be pushing, especially for those of us who are enlightened, to be pushing the argument and convincing people who are not ready or who don't understand. So that's really important to say. From the nutrition perspective, what we know is that empowered women are able to secure their own food and nutrition more effectively. And in doing that, they are also able to secure the food and nutrition of their younger children and more widely of their families. And so it's important to ensure that women have that agency to be able to take charge of their lives. And that way we have a much better society, a much better country where malnutrition is dealt with. So malnutrition, in many cases, is something that really affects mainly more women and children. And so it's important to focus on how women can be part of the solution to addressing malnutrition across the country.
Now,
So that's the connection.
Okay, now from your work, with women who own the businesses, could you tell us the kind of challenges that these women face in managing food and nutrition businesses?
Thank you. So the bias that we talk about finds its way into how the food system is organized and how it works. And I will just give a very quick example. So in Nigeria, for example, we see that a lot of the food that we produce is lost. The estimates suggest about 40% of our vegetables is lost between production and the table, about 50% of the fruits that we produce. And women have a particular role in the agriculture system. They are much more heavily represented in the post-harvest stage. So in terms of small-scale processing, storage, and so on. And if we don't focus on produce, one of the ways that this comes across is that the equipment even that women use are not designed with women in mind. And so that already becomes a problem with them actually being able to use some of the technology that's available for post-harvest loss reduction for many of the types of foods that we consume. But in terms of the wider challenges, the main one is finance. Women do not have access to finance. They don't have access to capital. The society that we are in gives a lot of the capital is in the hands of men. And even women in many of our societies don't actually inherit land, for example. So the key ingredients of production are not under their control. And so finance is a big thing. And even when you get beyond some of that as a woman and you want to try and run a business, you go to the bank to try and borrow money, it is more difficult for women to access loans because of the lack of capital to back it up, but also because they are not as likely as men to oversell what they bring, and so convince people who are making decisions about loans to support them. So finance is a big thing, but there's so many other things. I've already talked about technology, which is a problem again because we don't design a lot of the technology that we use in the food system with women in mind. That's also another problem.
But does the technology
example,
discriminate? I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering,
design a particular instrument, with women in mind? Is it done?
So again, just to maybe give an example from the kind of work that we do, the equipment or processes that you can design that would make it easier for women to be able to be part of. And so the size of the equipment that you're using, just the weight of it, the size of it, the way that it works, if you're thinking from a woman's perspective, some of this equipment would be designed differently. So yes, I know this sounds strange, but the bias that we have as men shows itself up in the way that some of these equipments are designed, which makes it more difficult for women to use and makes it less effective for them, which has an implication for the entire food system because we're missing out on productivity gains that we could have if women were more able to partake and be part of this system. And another problem that we find is just the lack of social capital for women. Men are able to access different networks that women are not able to. And part of that is because they don't have the time to be able to access these networks because of so many other competing priorities that women have to take care of, looking after children, looking after the men, cooking, and so on, which limits the time available to them to be part of productive society.
I'm wondering, Dr. Ojo, the scenario you are sketching, is this more related, for instance, to sole proprietorship rather than a corporatized approach to, say, value addition in the agricultural food chain? Because if you say, lack of access to capital or finance and so on and so forth, the gender-insensitive equipment or technology, as we have also indicated, some persons would argue that if you have cooperatives, that reduces the barriers to finance. And secondly, you've had the number of interventions by the government, for instance, the CBN and so on and so forth, and they would argue that there is no gender bias or even if it is subtle, at least it provides more tremendous access. to women. And then land. How does land inheritance become a factor? If for an individual, yes, let me just have a small space for my sharecropping and so on and so forth. That's because I'm an individual. But if it's a corporate entity, a cooperative, or even a business, then the issue of land as land inheritance doesn't arise. So are you looking at it from this small perspective of the individual farmer or from a corporatized environment, and therefore how to encourage women to get into this?
So whichever way you look at it, I think I suspect you are asking this to be an advocate. But whichever way you look at this is part of the problem that we need to address. What makes it, or why should men feel that they are the only ones who should be in charge of, if you like, large corporates? And why are we not, don't we have more women in charge of these large corporates? That's the question that we should be asking ourselves. And, so all of these issues around capital, land, access to finance and so on play a part in that. But when we look at our food systems, the majority of the production of food and, whether it's, producing, processing, marketing of food right through the system is done at a small scale. And so most of the companies who are involved are what we call SMEs, small and medium enterprises. And so whichever way you look at it, the lack of agency that women have and the bias against women, whether it's to do with finance or capital in other forms, is part of the reason why women are not able to play a full part. And so some of the work that we do is really targeting those SMEs in the food space and particularly working with women to ensure that we understand how to design our programs and our work to help them overcome some of these barriers that we see in the system.
Do you have a network? Are you working for women, with women across the nation or in some selected areas of the country?
Yeah, so the work that we do to support women in the food system, it takes many forms, but yes, one of them is through networks. I spoke earlier about the social capital that women don't have in the same way as men. We coordinate something called the Scaling Up Nutrition Business Network, or SBN. And that is an opportunity to bring not just women, but players in the food system together, but particularly try to understand what barriers women are facing in producing and supporting the food systems and helping us to make sure that people have access to safe and nutritious foods, and to try and address that in specific ways. So the interventions will be gender sensitive. We're trying to make sure that we're thinking about women in the way that we design the programs, but also gender transformative, really focusing on what we need to do to support women into the food system and help them be part of the solution, which they have to be. Otherwise, we put a hand behind our backs.
We'll have time to continue all this conversation, but at this point we'll have to thank you and appreciate your contribution this morning to the program. Dr. Michael Ujo, Country Director, Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition Gain.
Thank you very
for
much.
coming. All right, you're still watching Good Morning Nigeria, and we thank you for staying with us up to this moment. We'll take a short break now. When we come back, of course, we'll be dealing with the next segment of the program.
This is NTA News 24 broadcasting from Abuja. You can watch us anywhere, anytime on the following platforms. For more information, log on to our website www.nta.ng or join us on our social media handles, Facebook at NTA News 24.
For comments, suggestions and inquiries, send an email to news24@nta.gov.ng or call us on the following numbers.
NTA News 24,
news and more news.
All right, we just taking it easy while we moving on to the next conversation, still, of course, on the International Women's Day. The theme for this year's celebration is Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow, and it highlights the critical mission to advance gender equality in women's leadership. Kieran?
Yes, the annual commemoration of the day aims to bring awareness about the hardships faced by women and, of course, promote a gender-neutral society.
Now, as part of the programs to commemorate the 2022 International Women's Day here in Nigeria, we have two guests who are joining us now from our Lagos Network Center to focus specifically on gender balance and equitable access to education. I would like to first welcome Ijoma Adesonya. Ijoma Adesonya is founder, Kobikam Africa. Ijoma Adesonya, pleasure to have you with us on Good Morning Nigeria today. Right, and also in the studios there in Lagos is Abosede George Ogan, founder, Women in Leadership Advancement Network, WILAN Global. Abosede George Ogan, delight to have you on Good Morning Nigeria.
Good morning. Love to be here this morning.
Gender stereotypes played in limiting, the rate of education in Nigeria.
Thank you very much for that question. So if we think about a lot of the things that we've been speaking about this morning, the reason why we still have a day that is dedicated to actually spotlight, highlight, and celebrate what women is doing is because we recognize that there are specific stereotypes. And I think for our context in Nigeria, we're still dealing with a huge stereotype that is caused by our cultural and religious beliefs. Whether those are valid or otherwise is still yet to be proven. And we know that they're not. But unfortunately, whether it's across political, economic, and public life, young women, girls, and women themselves continue to suffer from these stereotypes that are caused as a result of the cultural and religious beliefs that we face in our country.
Well, Ijoma Adesonya, let's bring you into the conversation as well. When we're talking about stereotypes, how do those stereotypes, for instance, manifest in equitable access to education in Nigeria?
Yeah, so if you think about the fact that the education system in itself is mostly tilted to boys, especially in the secondary school, on the secondary school level, you can also see that there are certain things that women, young girls, I would call it gender roles that have been given to young girls that affect their participation in education. One of such things we can say is child marriage, which is something that in a sense is still cultural and religious, as Abosede said. Something else we can look at is also teenage pregnancy. So a lot of young girls at a certain age are not able to continue on with school because they've been pregnant, and that leads to a lot of obviously young girls in mostly junior secondary school not able to complete their education.
Let me still stay with you because in your submission, you said that secondary education is tilted towards boys. Well, that could be true to some extent, but I'm not sure other many Nigerians will agree with you on that, because if you say perhaps in some parts of northern Nigeria, one could agree with you based on early marriage system or phenomenon in that part of your information from.
what I was trying to explain with that is when we go through primary school, we find that there's the ratio between boys and girls are up to par. But when we come into secondary education, especially after junior secondary education, we find that a lot of girls are not able to complete that education. So we find that at the end of the day, we have more boys graduating secondary education than girls. And even looking at the facts, it shows that only 9% of our young people actually move on to tertiary education. So that shows that there's a gap, a huge gap from secondary to tertiary, and most of that is dominated by boys.
Thank you. But let's bring in again Ambassador George Ogan. I'm just wondering, so that we clarify this, I mean, there are persons who will be watching this at home and they will be asking themselves, hey, what are we looking at? Are we making progress at all in terms of equitable access to education? Because, as my colleague Kirian said, just by casual observation, you find school pupils, in their uniforms, mostly girls. You go to tertiary institutions, universities, you find ladies all over the place, which wasn't the case in the past. I mean, when I had my first degree, you could count the number of ladies who were in class with you. And today, if you were to go there, you can probably count the number of boys or men that you will find in such classes. But so overall, are we making progress in terms of providing more access to women? I also want to take this into account. Years past, if you like, decades ago, if a teenage girl had should we say misfortune, or had an accident of pregnancy, the tendency was for that to be the termination of her education, because the parents would invariably say marry her off, or compel whoever was responsible for the pregnancy to marry her. But that doesn't appear to be the case today. So what are we looking at? Are we making progress or are we regressing?
Very much. So I think the first place to start is a lot of what we're speaking about is actually based on a MasterCard Foundation Secondary Education in Africa report. So to Kirian's, I guess, question earlier about is this sort of fact-based? And I think to the point that Ijoma made earlier, so we see that enrollment, when it comes to enrollment, boys and girls, we're almost achieving parity. But again, as she said, it's really about completion, right? And there's specific skills that makes this really difficult. And, I think I find it really interesting that you're saying we see girls everywhere. And I think that is the bias lens, isn't it? Because it was scarce before. When we start to see numbers, then we sort of have a tendency as humans to exaggerate, the numbers that we're seeing because it has been scarce before. And really, I think that's what this International Women's Day sort of highlights, around breaking the bias, because there's a lot of unconscious bias that we live with and that we see through the lens of that actually helps us to interpret what it is that we're seeing. So let's start with the good news. The good news is that enrollment, we're almost at parity, but I think the emphasis is that we are not seeing completion rates, right? So that's one. So there's a huge need for us to close the gap around the quality of education and the relevance of the education, right? And what we see as an opportunity is that secondary school education is that place where we can literally change the course of a girl child's life, right? So she goes through primary school successfully, hopefully, but at the secondary school level, whether she has access to boarding facilities, if she's going to be in boarding school, for example, hygiene products because she's a young girl and needs access to these things. These are some of the things that the school system doesn't provide for, and therefore makes it comfortable for a girl to actually go through and complete. Ijoma also alluded to things like teenage pregnancy and all of that. But I also want to emphasize that the quality and the relevance of the education that girls and boys, but particularly girls, get in secondary education actually can set them, so it can sort of unlock their lot in life. And I think that's really important. So think about at secondary school level, does a girl have access to sort of all the foundational skills, so numeracy, literacy, and things like that? Does she have access to 21st century skills, right? So we're talking about work. Because ultimately, the challenge with the Nigerian education system is that people are complaining that the graduates that are coming out of our school system are not relevant to the work that is available. And so unemployment rate continues to increase because the gap between the education that our people are getting versus the work that is available, there is a huge gap. So how do we close that skill gap, all right, around the 21st century skills, around leadership, around creativity, problem solving, critical thinking? These are all things that if the girl went through a secondary school education, acquiring the skills, entrepreneurship. I think a lot of the things that Dr. Ojo spoke to earlier was around access to finance. We have seen the evidence, all right? 52% of the women who work are actually in informal employments. And that's because of the education gap. So I think that what we're trying to emphasize here this morning is the fact that this access is critical, especially at the secondary education level. Because if we do get it right, especially for girls, it will unlock their ability to actually fulfill their potential, whether in political life, in economic life, and in public life. So it really does start here, and that's the evidence that we see with the MasterCard Foundation secondary education report that has come out.
Well, I give it to you that the report from the foundation you mentioned is where you're laying your emphasis on. But I also want to believe that it's also necessary to examine other reports, concerning this issue of girl-child education in Nigeria, specifically when you talk about, secondary completing secondary school by girls. But of course, other reports that we have also gone through indicated really that there is an increase in girl child education in Nigeria, especially in the southern part of the country. All right, let's leave it at that. But let me just ask you this. Let me go to Ijoma Adesanya, the founder of Kwebicam Africa. What do you think should be done in the Nigeria's education system to ensure that all you complained about are taken care of with respect to young girls completing their education at secondary school level? What can be done to ensure that it does not continue?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I'll start with educational reforms. So currently in the curriculum, making sure that we include, as like Abosede said, those skills that are relevant for young girls and boys to be able to be relevant in the 21st century workplace. And another option as well is training teachers on bias, training teachers on the skills that are needed for participation in the workforce and for that to be effective and efficient for the young boys and girls. If you look at the fact that only 9% actually move to tertiary education in sub-Saharan Africa, that's a huge gap. So where we really need to be focused on is the secondary education. And so when we train the teachers on this new curriculum, not necessarily completely overhauling the curriculum, but actually bringing in or adapting the curriculum to be able to take in certain skills that are needed for the workplace. Like Abosede said, critical skills, even extracurricular activities. And this is where not just the government, but other institutions, the private sector, international organizations, and just the stakeholders come together and think about ways that we can improve the employability of boys and girls in Nigeria.
All right, Ijoma Adesanya, thanks. Let's bring in again George Ogan into this aspect. Okay, it looks like the MasterCard Foundation report you are referencing focuses on completion challenges for the girl child in terms of secondary school. What are the recommendations therein? You speak about skills and skills and skills. Some of these skills you talk about actually have their foundation in basic education. So what are the recommendations going forward?
A major recommendation will be sort of adapting our learning and teaching system. I think that, again, just the gap between the quality of the graduates who come out of these systems and the fact that they're not relevant skills. So to your point, the emphasis on examination, all right, and those type of assessments versus are people really learning and the ability to apply what they're learning. So that's a huge gap. And then I think that something else that we can do is how are we funding? So finance is a huge part of this education conversation and providing access for all. Because what we see today is whether you talk about the quality of the teachers, the quality of the learning environment, or the quality of the curriculum, a lot of it is linked to the fact that we have limited finance and whether this is from government financing. And so getting creative about how we provide equity financing. So looking for opportunities for us to have result-based financing where we have adaptive education models. So we don't just take it as a template that this is how we've been doing it, therefore this is how we're going to do it. But to be honest, in other parts of the world, they're actually doing something called choice-based learning, right? Where you identify what my areas of strength are, what the skills that I technically, or rather, I have naturally, and you sort of nudge me in that direction. Because remember that ultimately, education is to help these people as individuals, especially young girls, become valuable contributors to society. And so we must not forget that. And so if you want to draw an equation, all right, it doesn't stop at education. It stops at the fact that this young girl then has a chance to contribute economically to the country and to the nation and to the continent of Africa in a way that we begin to prosper. So I think it's this conversation about how do we include everybody, but we need to provide access to diversified funding. So government cannot do it alone, and I think Ijoma made that point. It's going to take a collaboration amongst stakeholders, whether this is through the CSR, whether this is through international foundations like the MasterCard Foundation. So in the case of MasterCard Foundation, they're giving out 37,000 scholarships. All right, and 27,000 of those have actually been at the secondary school level, with women and young girls benefiting 75% of that. And I think that the more we have other players coming into this space, I think the better it will be. But we need to look at how do we